What's up, everybody? My name is Fortefyre, and welcome to the next entry of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today, we're going to be talking all about Ubisoft, and I have some friends that are returning, some veteran speakers who are going to help me do that. Now, before we get into this, a few things. Number one, it's been a very long time since I've made a Ready Go Gaming Show. There's a few reasons. Number one, my dad passed away, and when my dad passed away, I lost a lot of interest in making long-form content, right? In fact, it's a miracle that I decided to get onto here again and start making 10 games episodes, and we all know how that turned out. It turned out for the better, but I felt like I was neglecting a lot of the long-form content that I had been doing for, 5-6 years. So I didn't want this episode to burn a hole in my pocket. I wanted to get into it. I wanted to finish it. And because of that, this is written from the perspective of 2021. There are some games that are going to be left out because the amount of effort it would take to re-script everything, get all of our guest speakers to speak again, and to edit all of that, it would just be a pain in the ass, a massive pain in the ass. And I would much rather release the episode in the way that it was intended, back when I had a shittier microphone and back whenever I was using a different format than you would see now. So hopefully this episode will mark the transition to a new style of Ready Go Gaming Show, one where I use some of my newer techniques and some of my newer speaking patterns to make a quality video that educates you all. And I'm not going to be doing it alone. Today I've got two veteran guest speakers, the first of which is TheDosNerd. TheDosNerd is my subject matter expert on everything DOS. He's a former Twitch streamer, or he streams like occasionally, not very often. Absolute sweetheart. I've known him for a very long time. He's been there since the beginning of the Ready Go Gaming Show, back towards the beginning of my YouTube career, and he's been a constant supporter of what I do, basically mentally and physically every single day. And our second guest speaker is another long-time supporter of what I do every day, this madness that is this project. His name is Sicjake, and he is a streamer. He's also the owner of the podcast, or one of the speakers for the podcast, Press B to Cancel, which I will link down in the description below. I've talked a lot, and I just want to get into this because we've got an hour of information coming your way, and I hope that you have a good time, all right? Enjoy. Bonjour. Welcome to France in the 80s. It's a simple time. People are enjoying life, eating amazing food, soaking in the sunshine, and also rioting. That's what the French like to do. Good old-fashioned riots. But in a commune of Brittany, Carentois, a few siblings are putting their minds together to help their local farmers. These folks would be known as the Guillemot family. They consisted of 5 sons: Christian, Claude, Gerard, Michel, and Yves. The Guillemot family was well known in Brittany for providing support for local farmers, supplementing their business with things we don't exactly know. But with a great understanding of business, the 5 brothers went to college and came back with, well, even more business knowledge.
Cloud, in particular, thought it would be cool to bring this fancy new thing called the CD to these farmers. And with the success of that, eventually branched out to providing computers and software. Because you know what a farmer needs? Streamlined software. And to run this software, those same farmers needed computers. It's the classic challenge of supply and demand to a niche market that likely wasn't technologically literate. But it was an expensive thing to do, and farmers throughout the world aren't exactly the spitting image of wealth. In attempting to purchase their sales assets domestically, the Guillemot brothers found it non-viable, especially in France. But you know what wasn't expensive at the time? Importing them from places that already had great technological advances, like the United Kingdom.
With a plan in mind, their mother planted the seed of starting an actual business among the 5 brothers, suggesting that each managed it themselves and had equal equity at all times. This would lead to Guillemot Informatique in 1984. Much like other companies at the time, and especially when it involved farmers, their products were ordered courtesy of the mail ordering format, a format that allowed them to undercut their competitors by 50% of the industry standard. In 2 years, Guillemot Informatique earned 40 million francs, the US equivalent at the time being $5.8 million. This led to an upgrade by Guillemot Corporation doing the same thing in 1986.
Man, this video game thing is kind of lucrative. What if we, made the games? That's what they did. And in that year, Ubisoft Entertainment SA, eventually just nixed to Ubisoft, stemming from the term ubiquitous, was created. But what does that mean? Well, it's a fancy word for fancy pants people, but ubiquitous means present, appearing, or found everywhere. Pretty nifty, now you know. With the company created, they set their roots down in Paris. They brought on powerful folks with industry experience to help get their game journey started. Nathalie Salud was a proud manager, and Sylvie Hugonnier was a faithful director of marketing and public relations, and, she left for Elite Software. Well, shit. Luckily for Ubisoft, they still managed to sneak out some games, and, well, the rest is history. The first title from Ubisoft would be known as Zombie. It was a first-person action adventure inspired by Dawn of the Dead. You explore different locations such as a shopping mall, gun shop, and trucks. It was a mildly popular and successful game, and if you know anything about the Wii U, it might make sense why Ubisoft released a game called Zombie U and why it was spelled that way. With this mild success in the European market and with a well-established reputation for importing software as well as technology, they were able to branch out and begin importing well-known titles from Spain and West Germany. After this, Yves Guillemot was appointed CEO.
Ubisoft was your traditional small-started development team. By 1988, they had a team of 6 people, one of which was Michel Ancel, another of which was Serge Hoskowitz. You might not recognize these names, but Michel would create a powerhouse franchise that would catapult Ubisoft forward, and the other would end up being the chief creative officer. Talk about climbing the ladder, huh? As we roll into the 90s, Ubisoft was the most powerful distributor of video games in France. With a massive success, it's time to move forward and expand to the rest of the world. This was done by striking deals with EA, Sierra Online, Microprose, and more, supplemented with an IPO in 1996, generating $80 million for expansion. Because of this, 4 more studios were created: Annecy, Shanghai, Montreal, and Milan. With the growth of the company and with games still being developed, many of which weren't incredibly remarkable, such as Pod, Adventures in Music with the Recorder, The Adventures of Valdo and Marie, or F1 Racing Simulation.
But one game that stuck was 1995's Rayman, designed by Michel Ancel. What's interesting is that Ancel designed what would become Rayman back in the 80s when he was a teenager, which acted as a litmus test for his skills. Ancel was learning how to compose, code games, draw, and in the 90s learned ray tracing techniques, and now his unnamed protagonist had a name, Rayman. But with its success in Europe, Ubisoft still struggled to cement their presence in the United States. One particular format that was starting to gain popularity in the gaming industry was the free-to-play format. In 1999, one of the brothers, Michel, brought this to fruition by creating Gameloft. Remember that? Gameloft had tons of free games, and if you're a kid like me, free was good. It was so good that it increased Ubisoft's share value 5 times its worth, and with that, Ubisoft was prepared for international growth, unlike any other company at the time.
You're probably wondering when Ubisoft began making the games we love, those that stuck. Well, the late 90s and the early 2000s. That's because with their success from Gameloft, they were able to purchase Red Storm Entertainment, which, if you know anything about them, is the studio responsible for everything Tom Clancy. But it doesn't stop there. They bought the Learning Company, which by proxy gave them claim to Broderbund, Mattel Interactive, Mindscape, and Strategic Simulations. Missed anyone? How about the Prince of Persia? I know you've probably played Sands of Time. It was massively popular for the PS2, a cult classic, just like Beyond Good and Evil, which was a commercial flop, but still has a commercial following. As we waltzed into 2003, Ubisoft was renamed Ubisoft. They also decided this cool purple swirl would be their logo moving forward, and guess what? It hasn't gone anywhere.
The modern history of Ubisoft has mostly been political. They were the Electronic Arts of Europe, with massive acquisitions, and even Electronic Arts wanted a piece of their action. In 2004, EA purchased a 19.9% stake in Ubisoft, and if you know anything about business ethics, this can be a huge no-no because it signals the intent of a hostile takeover. The same thing would happen with Vivendi, which, no bullshit, they were known for hostile takeovers, but this wasn't until 2015. In between that, they bought NHL Rivals, NFL Fever, and NBA Inside Drive from Microsoft. They created Assassin's Creed, a series that still survives to this day, and Driver, a series that kind of ebbed and flowed through the 90s and 2000s, and even bought the video game rights for South Park. They bought Massive Entertainment, and started offering third-party publishing rights to Electronic Arts as well as Warner Brothers.
Not much has changed with Ubisoft. They did have a run-in with sexual misconduct allegations, much like Blizzard, and it was almost as high visibility as Blizzard as well. Since 2018, Ubisoft has made a partnership with Tencent to make sure their games thrive in the Chinese market. Ubisoft, without a doubt, is one of the most powerful and influential companies from a business perspective, but not so much in application with their games. Some people might recall their shoddy QA practices or even their capitalistic cash grab of the Uplay store. But even with all of these black marks, they continue to grow to this day.
Oh boy, subsidiaries. I'm always excited to talk about subsidiaries.
Well,
What?
I don't think you're going to like this one.
Why is that?
Ubisoft has a few subsidiaries.
That's not bad.
If by a few, I meant 40 plus subsidiaries.
40?
Well, 58, but who's counting?
58?
58.
Well, fuck me. Let's talk about them.
Whoa. Forte. Nobody wants a video of non-stop bouncing between companies. Let's simplify it by region and give a little brief blurb about them if they're important. Then we'll talk about them in depth. But for the most part, they're all part of the same family. Don't worry, I'll start. In the North American region, Ubisoft had 13 studios. These studios are Blue Mammoth Games, Red Storm Entertainment, Ubisoft CRC, Hybrid Technologies, Quizal, Ubisoft Montreal, Ubisoft Quebec, Ubisoft Saguenay, Ubisoft Sherbrooke, Ubisoft Toronto, Ubisoft Winnipeg, Ubisoft Halifax. Most of these companies just tend to work on Ubisoft products, specifically Far Cry, Assassin's Creed, South Park, Brawlhalla, Watch Dogs, the works. But some stand out from a historical standpoint.
Red Storm Entertainment, in my opinion, is perhaps one of the most important North American acquisitions. It all starts with some guy named Tom Clancy. You might have heard of him, if not by his name being in most games Ubisoft puts out, or in any of the books he wrote. He is a well-known American author, and most of his books directly spawn video games, and in some cases, movies. For example, his first book was The Hunt for Red October. Because of that book, we got a movie with Sean Connery as Marco Ramius, and Alec Baldwin as Jack Ryan. That's another well-known name. Well, in the spirit of bullshit, The Hunt for Red October generated a video game on many consoles. Patriot Games? Movie. Cardinal of the Kremlin? Game. Clear and Present Danger? Movie. The Sum of All Fears? Movie. And a reference to John Clark, who you might recognize from the very first Rainbow Six game.
Through and through, Tom Clancy's works have inspired tons of games, and his writing style spawned the Splinter Cell series, which was supposed to be the title that would annihilate Metal Gear Solid 2. We'll leave it up to you if it did. Anyway, returning to Red Storm, Clancy's manager, Doug Littlejohns, reached out to Virtus Corporation and created Red Storm. Since the beginning of its creation, it's solely been a way for Tom Clancy's works to be imagined on a video game spectrum, or at least have the spirit of his writing style. Ubisoft would scoop the brand up in 2000, but I think it's fair to say Clancy still had most of the say. Unfortunately, Tom Clancy passed away in 2013, but his spirit still lives on in all the games we play that bear his name.
The second quasi-important studio would be Ubisoft Halifax. Ready to rock, eh? Well, Longtail Studios Halifax created a fun time waster known as Rocksmith, but it wasn't always in Halifax. Longtail Studios, a New York City company, was created by Gerald Gilmour. Remember that name? He founded Ubisoft. The more you know, right? Halifax works on mobile games now, from guitars in your hand to mindless eyeball torture. Full circle, right?
The final major studio in the North American region would be Ubisoft Montreal, and that's because in the overall scope of Ubisoft products, they do the most. They stick their toes in 99% of the projects that Ubisoft creates, and they have the most employees, with 40,000 as of May 2021. They created Assassin's Creed and helped push Far Cry further into relevance. If there are any new IPs that Ubisoft would like to make, you can count on Montreal being the think tank for it.
Europe, however, is where Ubisoft seems to have most of their studios. In France, we have 1492, Green Panda, i3D.net, Ubisoft Ivory Tower, Ketchup, Ubisoft Nadeo, Alliant, Ubisoft Annecy, Ubisoft Bordeaux, Ubisoft Montpellier, Ubisoft Paris, and Ubisoft Reflections. In the United Kingdom, we have Ubisoft CRC, or the EMEA, as well as Ubisoft Leamington. In Germany, we have Colibri, Blue Byte, Ubisoft Berlin, and Ubisoft Mainz. In the Scandinavian region, we have Massive Entertainment, Ubisoft Stockholm, and Ubisoft Red Lynx. Hopping back down to Spain, we have Ubisoft Barcelona, which also has its own little spin-off known as Barcelona Mobile. In the Southeast region, we have Ubisoft Belgrade, Ubisoft Bucharest, Ubisoft Kiev, Ubisoft Odessa, Ubisoft Milan, and Ubisoft Sofia. That's a lot of companies.
But the issue is that most of these companies all have shared interests. They all work on the same projects, and as such, describing each of them would be the same thing, 20 times? No, fuck that. The most important acquisition in Europe, in our opinion, was Blue Byte, known as Ubisoft Dusseldorf for a long time. Ubisoft Dusseldorf's history goes far back. You ever play this? This is Turrican. It's a side-scrolling cross between Metroid and other obscure titles such as Psycho Nick's Oscar. It's an absolute cult classic by Manfred Trenz that was ported to the Commodore 64 by Rainbow Arts. Rainbow Arts had two developers named Thomas Hertzler and Lothar Schmidt, who decided to create their own company, Blue Bytes. Their first game as a new company was Great Courts, a tennis title that was published by, Ubisoft. They also have some well-known games such as Anno, Battle Isle, and The Settlers, but in 2001, Ubisoft acquired them for good. As a developer for Ubisoft, they didn't do anything too crazy. Some of the games you might recognize are Rainbow Six Siege, The Fractured But Whole with Reflections, and Far Cry 6. They are also going to be involved with Beyond Good and Evil 2. The last major area, if you will, is Asia. These studios are Ubisoft Abu Dhabi, Ubisoft Chengdu, Ubisoft Da Nang, Ubisoft Mumbai, Ubisoft Osaka, Ubisoft Philippines, Ubisoft Pune, Ubisoft Shanghai, and Ubisoft Singapore.
Yeah, that was a way more efficient way of doing things.
See? You should trust me more often.
Well, it's time to talk franchises, so let's hop into that. It's the best part of these episodes anyway.
Yeah, if I'm going to talk for longer than I should, I'd rather talk video games.
I guess I'll take the lead. Anno is a long-standing series that is a blend of real-time strategy coupled with economic simulation. The first game was created in 1998 by Max Design, which would be the company to work on the first two entries before Related Designs would take over. The game was called Anno 1602 or 1602 AD if you were in the North American market. The game itself is rather arduous and has a pretty nasty learning curve, but if you manage to overcome that curve, you can have tons of fun. Compared to games like The Settlers and Age of Empires, you don't have civilizations, and with that, there aren't any technological advances like you would see in Civilization by Sid Meier. It's hard to explain without you playing. Overall, this game is just about discovery versus domination. In the German markets, it was a commercial hit, but in the rest of the world, it was more of a sleeper hit.
The follow-up would be Anno 1503, The New World, or 1503 AD, The New World. As with its predecessor, Anno 1503 is a tad bit different. Fundamentally, it's the same game, but it has more of a militaristic focus. The third game was Anno 1701, or 1701 AD. In many ways, this game is dramatically different when it comes to the level of interaction you have with your colonies. For example, in the previous games, taxes were derived from conditions of your colony's growth. But in 1701, you could set your tax level to include the taxes for each item. That means if you want chocolate to have a 98% tax, you could. As a leader, you could be more lenient for other things, such as perfumes or furs. Each different culture had a commodity tied to it, and 5 major stages dictated your abilities. Everyone starts as pioneers, but progresses to settlers, citizens, merchants, and then aristocrats. Much like its predating titles, it was a massive hit, which is probably why Ubisoft was so interested in acquiring the IP.
Which is exactly what happened with Anno 1404. Blue Byte, or if you paid attention, Ubisoft Dusseldorf, revamped Anno to have several different features. For example, you can have multiple different cultural zones for your citizens. There are different levels of housing you can employ. There are class ratios, different goods such as spices, bread, meat, milk, carpets, and tons of quests that help build the baseline experience. It also was the first game to implement an achievement system in the Anno series, and also the first to have a dedicated plot. The whole story revolves around the Occidental versus the Orient. This game also had an expansion with 1404 Venice. Then for the next game, we jump to 2070. Welcome to the future! In this game, politics are irrelevant and humans choose their ways to produce energy. There is one overlord umbrella global government, where votes are tallied out by 3 factions. These factions include the Eden Initiative, the Global Trust, and the SAAT. Each of these factions has its positives and negatives. For example, the Eden Initiative utilizes ecologically beneficial environmental builds, which are sustainable but incredibly slow to grow. The Global Trust has tons of industrial experience, but because of that, produces high quantities of pollution and abuses resources to no end, to the point of extinction.
There are also world events, such as Neo Skull's Pirates, the Project Eden event, Global Distrust, and more. This game is very ambitious, and as is expected, was very successful. Anno 2020-05 was released in 2015, and the major change was that you can get resources from the moon. I hope that isn't the direction our society is going, but if you want to have a test run of how that might be, then yeah, play 2020-05 because that is exactly how it would pan out. Ubisoft Blue Byte expected this game to be just like its predecessors when it came to sales, but it wasn't great. This game has stunning visuals, but the inherent issue is that they nuked the elements of the game to basic bitch status. They yanked combat, there wasn't any randomly generated maps, and with no multiplayer options, it just wasn't interesting to consumers. So what do? We go back to basics with Anno 1800. Anno 1800, we are dropped into the 19th century at the dawn of the Industrial Age. All of the older mechanics that made Anno successful were brought back, and one of the cooler things they implemented was Blueprint Mode. In Blueprint Mode, you could slowly add money and resources towards building objects of importance bit by bit, versus having to save up for the whole cost. In addition, tourists play a pivotal role in your economy. Thankfully, this saved the franchise, and hopefully, we will see more of this legacy IP.
Well, here's the biggest cash cow historically for Ubisoft, Assassin's Creed. Many of you might be familiar with the series, but if you aren't, Assassin's Creed is an open-world action-adventure stealth murder assassination collectathon, all bundled up together and re-released 50 times to consumers all over the world. But where did it start? In 2007 with Assassin's Creed on the PS3, 360, and the computer. In this first story arc, we follow the story of a bartender named Desmond Miles who is kidnapped by agents of Abstergo Industries, the leading big pharma of the Assassin's Creed universe. He gets taken to Rome for the sole purpose of activating latent genetic memories courtesy of a machine called the Animus. For this game, we tap into the ancestor Altair ibn Lahad from the era of the Third Crusade, who's a member of the Assassin Order tasked with obtaining the Apple of Eden. Altair's arrogance results in a failed mission, and his mentor and leader Al-Mualim demotes him to the most basic rank and gives him orders to assassinate high-profile targets to regain his trust.
And welcome to the basic principle format of the entire series. Assassin's Creed was fun, but it was repetitive. As a pilot game for the IP, it did establish the seeds of interest as a modern stealth game, and compared to Ubisoft's previous game, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, it was monumentally successful and critically acclaimed. The next game in the series, Assassin's Creed 2, in my opinion, is where Assassin's Creed truly began to be a household name, because the elements of parkour, the story, and the visuals were all perfect. For many of us, this game was the one that not only made us intrigued to continue the franchise, but made us play the previous game as well. It was beautiful. The game picks up where we last left off, with Desmond Miles escaping the clutches of Abstergo by way of Lucy Stillman, who is part of the Assassin Order as well. They run off to a safe house and use their Animus to tap into the memories of Ezio Auditore de Firenze during the Italian Renaissance.
What makes Assassin's Creed 2 so phenomenal is just how fluid it feels. Climbing doesn't seem limited. We could use our eagle vision whenever we wanted to. We could use these skills that were so badass to take out our enemies, and if they tried to use a weapon on us, we could yank it out of their hands and stab them in the throat. AC2 is just exemplary. It also came with 2 DLCs, the Battle for Lee and the Bonfire of the Vanties. both of which are great additions to the baseline game. Plus, the customization was incredible. You could upgrade armor, get different weapons, even dye your clothes to look cooler. It was just a solid game. Our next venture would be Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, which had a slower start than the other games. However, as you learn the mechanics, it truly became an interesting entry in the series. In Brotherhood, we are continuing to tap into the memories of Ezio, courtesy of another Animus installed at the ruins of the Villa Adidor. The key enemies in this game are the Borgia family, which, a nice little touch in many ways, speaks testaments to the historical intricacies of this title. Brotherhood had different mechanics, mainly this Brotherhood Assist move, or BAM, that allowed you to recruit NPCs throughout the game and then call on them to assassinate targets if you were overwhelmed. There were tougher enemies, and the AI was relentless in defending their masters. But the combat? Amazing. You could enter what was known as an execution string, and it would allow you to continue to kill any enemy that came your way as long as you executed the combos correctly. Also, Brotherhood was the first AC entry to have multiplayer. Assassin's Creed Revelations would be the final entry for Ezio. The Hidden Blade was out, and the Hooked Blade was in. This was mainly added to compensate for Ezio's old age at the time. And the dialogue of Ezio in the game is amazing because he constantly states how he is too old to be doing this. But what makes Revelations so interesting is that multiple missions include not only Ezio, but Desmond as well as Altair, with an important part of the game involving finding Altair's remains. In some ways, it was a nice calling card for us folks that really enjoyed the Ezio trilogy.
Then Ubisoft started getting ambitious, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just in some ways they painted themselves into a corner. This was sort of evident in Assassin's Creed 3. The gang is back and trying to find the Grand Temple of the First Civilization, now, because they found the Apple of Eden, and this godlike figure Juno starts messing with his brain, causing him to relive the memories of Haytham Kenway. The problem is, Haytham is a Templar. That's not right. To date, we've never had to play as a Templar, but here we are, doing it. We go through the motions and finally end up playing the character that matters, the son of Kenway, Connor. I'm not going to try to pronounce his real name because it would likely be disrespectful, but Connor is the name that retired assassin's Achilles Davenport gives to him.
Connor embarks on missions during the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War, and as such, many figureheads are relevant, such as George Washington. For a new era of Assassin's Creed games, this was fun, and of course, with the introduction of naval combat, it was even more fun. All the elements that made Assassin's Creed popular stayed, and it seemed that Ubisoft found a niche, and that made sense. Then we had Black Flag. If you were like me, this dropped us on our heads. A pirate game with commercial piracy following along the elements we loved in the other games? Sign me up! This game is considered by many to be the best, if not the best game in the series. 15 million copies have sold since 2020, and literally everything is perfect. You play as Edward Kenway, the father of Haytham Kenway and the grandfather of Connor, who not only is a privateer, but he's an assassin. So you play a pirate assassin with your ship.
That's exactly what you do. You meet tons of other pirates like Anne Bonny, Stede Bonnet, Mary Read, Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Benjamin Hornigold. It's a pirate lover's wet dream, aka me. But then things got kind of weird. In 2014, Ubisoft released 2 games in the mainline, Rogue and Unity. If you're like me, you didn't realize it until it was too late. Assassin's Creed Rogue or Unity, I chose the latter. Boy, was that a mistake. The first one, however, was Rogue, in which you play as Shay Patrick Cormac, a former assassin that is treated poorly due to insubordination. By the way, Cormac's master is Achilles Davenport from Assassin's Creed 3, full circle. Cormac is betrayed and turns to Haytham Kenway for guidance, so in some way you become an assassin hunter. And through time you make your way to France to get a box containing precursor artifacts. Cormac assassinates Charles Dorian, the father of Arno Dorian, and welcomes him to Assassin's Creed Unity. Yay.
Unity was a piece of shit. I do not say that lightly. Unity was a piece of shit. Everything that made Assassin's Creed an Assassin's Creed title was yanked and thrown into the fire. The game looked pretty, and the music was great, and the historical setting of France at the time of the French Revolution was an amazing concept. But the sheer amount of lazy bugs left in the game meant that while you were running, you'd fall through roofs into the Neverland. I swore I saw Macaulay Culkin a few times because of this. NPCs would just walk away, mid-dialogue, and that dialogue, it felt lazy. The gameplay, the mission design, and the techniques that you would use being pulled away were just rude to consumers. It was even ruder that they required Ubisoft in-game currency that you would earn through multiplayer to add a skill tree. Arno Dorian was the most impractical assassin, and the entire game was lazy.
Luckily, Ubisoft decided to pull its head out of its ass and get back to business creating unique Assassin's Creed entries that had meaning, decent plot, and historical relevance. For the next 2 games, they would even up the ante and let us play as not 1, but 2 assassins. 2! This game was Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and it was released in 2015 for all systems relevant at the time. This time we were in Victorian England, playing as Jacob and Evie Fry, 2 twins who happen to both be assassins. The charm in this game is that even though we are still going up against Templars, the characters are so incredibly unique, with their abilities and their equipment options, which allow for different gameplay. Plus all that stupid shit they tried to force on the player in Unity, it's gone. Thank God. Also, one thing I failed to mention is now that the Desmond Miles saga is over, the whole real-world plot of the game involves a video game studio known as Abstergo Studios, or Abstergo Enterprises. It doesn't add much to the ambiance, but it exists.
In 2017, we ventured to Egypt with Assassin's Creed Origins. From a development standpoint, this title was being designed immediately after Black Flag, so if you've been paying attention, you can see how all the Ubisoft subsidiaries and international branches tend to work in tandem to make amazing things happen. We saw 3 games released in the franchise, and this little gem was being made behind our backs. Who would have thought? Anyway, back to the game. Origins is a different style of Assassin's Creed. In many ways, people tend to approach this as a role-playing stylized game. Why? Because Syndicate didn't sell well. Ubisoft wanted to kind of revamp the game after tons of titles that were stealth games. If you've ever actually buckled down and played the Assassin's Creed titles, you know that, well, they're repetitive. It's the same formula. Get the target, do missions, get swords, get a cutscene, and the works. Origins sought to break that formula.
This time we play as Bayek of Siwa and his wife Aya during the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history. The pharaoh Ptolemy XIII is having a rough time because his sister Cleopatra likes getting jiggy with this Roman guy named Julius Caesar. And yeah, that's our backstory. Combat is slightly different with this strange hitbox revamp that feels more like a glorified hack and slash. But all in all, the game is fun and it is worth checking out. You tired of being in Egypt? Well, it's time to go to Greece in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Due to the massive changes with Origins, namely the change from a stealth game to an action role-playing game genre, we would expect Ubisoft to get it right. Right? Well, yeah. Many individuals considered this is the title that made the transition worth it. We play as either Alexios or Cassandra, who are direct descendants of Leonidas I. You know, the 300 guys. And our job is to stop the cult of Cosmos. There are a lot of things to do in this game, such as conquests and the ability to fight for either the Athenians or the Spartans to consolidate in various nation-states. You can assassinate leaders or burn the treasury down, pillage their lands. It's Black Flag without the piracy, and instead you're focused on land battles.
In 2020, we were exposed to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Viking time! That's right, fucking Viking time! We play as Eivor Varinsdottir, a Viking raider who is trying to create a new clan in England. Given the backstory of all the Assassin's Creed games, the Templars and the Assassins all playing a role, and Eivor finds himself in the middle of it. One of the unique aspects of Valhalla is that while we still have the option to do linear missions, there are side missions involving Eivor that can either end in a violent means or a diplomatic means. This is a major departure given that most of the time we kill everyone we run into during the game. The title also departs from the others by incorporating a skill tree versus the traditional leveling system that was incorporated in earlier titles. The enemies are more difficult, so add scaling to the game, and with 25 different enemy archetypes, there's always a unique way to challenge the player. Conquests are back because we can't have a Viking character and not raid settlements. That would be silly. Valhalla is a great title, and you should check it out.
Now, it does have to be mentioned that while there were tons of main console releases for the franchise, there were tons of shithole handheld spin-offs that dragged their balls across our forehead. The first was Assassin's Creed Altair's Chronicles. Imagine Mortal Kombat mythology Sub-Zero, but with a coat of Assassin's Creed paint. You do tons of running to the side while doing subpar parkour and mini-games like pickpocketing, all on the Nintendo DS. It looks like shit, and as a handheld port, it's more of a way to pass the time. The next game would be Assassin's Creed Bloodlines. Thankfully, the PSP has more of a capability to run a AAA game down mixed to handhelds. Unlike the previous game, this looks like an Assassin's Creed title. It still sucks, but it's playable. Then we have Assassin's Creed 2 Discovery. I don't know how they managed to make it worse, but they did. The game looks like shit. They cared more about how the environments looked as opposed to the character you fucking play. Look at this. This isn't good. It's pixelated to shit. It's a gimmick cash grab, and I'm upset that it exists.
Then we hop to the PS Vita with Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation. Let's be honest. Compare the DS to the PSP. The PSP will always win. The PS Vita? Well, companies had more of an ability to make the games look decent. The problem in this case is that the game doesn't interface with the Vita very well. Gameplay-wise, it isn't bad, but some mini-games involve the front and back touchpad, such as pickpocketing or opening letters, and they are very inconsistent. However, if you want to check this game out in its HD glory, you can. It was released for the 360, PS3, and Windows, the whole works. It's a full-up game with control in your hand, the way it should always be. Like mobile games? No, of course you don't. That's why Assassin's Creed Identity failed miserably. Or did it? Well, no, it didn't. Check this out. This looks great. The issue comes primarily due to the combat controls, but other than that, it's not a bad game. Honestly, if you want to play any of the handheld titles, this might be the sole one to check out.
Our final spin-off game is a game called Assassin's Creed Chronicles. It's a weird one. In this game, you play as 3 different assassins, Arbaz Mir, Shao Jun, and Nikolai Orlov in 3 chapters, India, China, and Russia, respectively. This game is a 2.5D shitfest that feels more like a glorified puzzle game, and that's basically it for Assassin's Creed.
Brothers in Arms is a tactical shooter that has a long history of unique mechanics that stand out among its competitors. One of the major trends you'll find when it comes to this franchise is that you simply can't run and gun your way to victory. Battlefield psychology is incorporated. What does this mean? It means that for your shots to be effective, you need to order your squads to lay suppressing fire. In the real world, you can't be accurate if you have thousands of rounds pouring down on you, and to me, that was a piece of realism that many other games haven't touched on. There are a few games in the series, but following the rules of the show, the first 2 games weren't developed by Ubisoft, but instead by Gearbox Software. You might know them from the Borderlands series. Gearbox developed both Brothers in Arms, Road to Hill 30, as well as Brothers in Arms Earned in Blood. Ubisoft Shanghai did pop in for the 3rd game, Brothers in Arms D-Day, which is a PSP compilation / crossover for the first 2 games. So in some way, it's essentially the same as playing the first 2, just on the PSP. It was a subpar game. This was the only entry that Ubisoft developed and published. The rest were either done by Gameloft, Zen Studios, or by Gearbox. If you're curious about this franchise, just know there are 12 games to check out.
Chessmaster has a rich history of being one of the best-selling franchises in the history of chess-related video games, with 5 million copies being sold as of 2002. But the franchise didn't start with Ubisoft. Instead, it was created by a company known as Software Toolworks, and because of that, there were 12 titles created in the franchise before Ubisoft ever touched it. With Ubisoft at the helm, we received Chessmaster 9000, Chessmaster on mobile, Chessmaster 10th Edition, Chessmaster Challenge, Chessmaster 11, Grandmaster Edition, and Chessmaster Live. These are all the same games, but with different aesthetic elements. But if you want a good, solid, no bullshit chess game, this is the series you want to check out, and it goes back to 1986 with Chessmaster 2000.
Racing games are very niche. More often than not, the only thing that separates good racing games from great racing games are the mechanics themselves. The Crew was developed and published by Ubisoft in 2014, and by then we had Gran Turismo 6, F1 2014, Mario Kart 8, Assetto Corsa, and many other racing titles. How did The Crew stand out? It had a persistent world set across the lower 48. This means you could drive from New York City to Los Angeles, then to New Orleans, and then to Seattle. The distance is somewhat simulated, but the way the game handles it, it truly feels as if you're driving across the nation. Plot-wise, we play as Alex Taylor, who is on the run from the cops in Detroit. He finds a car, then gets busted by the FBI and charged with murder. Then you get released on the condition that you help expose corruption, and this is a Fast and the Furious plot. Upon release, it was incredibly buggy, which I wouldn't put past Ubisoft's QA teams because sometimes it feels like they don't give a shit. It received mediocre reviews, but if you like games like this, you might like it.
It did have a follow-up with The Crew 2 in 2018, and much like its predecessor, it keeps the same energy and same mechanics and same perpetual open world. No Fast and Furious plot this time. Instead, you're just trying to become an expert in all of the different racing disciplines, such as freestyle and pro style, etc. There is another sequel coming out soon, according to Ubisoft. It's going to be called The Crew Motorfest. And who knows, maybe it'll be better than the previous two, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
CSI was an amazing show that had 5 different iterations. CSI was the television show that made me interested in forensics, so much so that I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in the damn thing. But as with all good TV shows, companies are going to want to make video games that parallel it, which is exactly what Ubisoft did. But what's crazy is that they're kind of fun, which breaks the mold of what TV games traditionally were. The first game was CSI Crime Scene Investigation, which takes place in the original CSI universe in Las Vegas. There are 5 cases, all of varying depravity, that culminate into a connection to the 5th case. You have all the tools of the trade, and while the vast majority of folks didn't like it, it was still great for the niche community that enjoyed it.
The follow-up would be CSI Dark Motives, with another 5 amazing cases, such as sabotage at a stunt show, a murder in an abandoned insane asylum, human remains found at a construction site, a theatrical rehearsal gone wrong, and a toe found in a Komodo dragon's cage. The cases are all unique, and the gameplay is still great, if you like CSI. The third game was 3 Dimensions of Murder, which let you physically walk around. This is cool because the other titles just let you observe the environment like a point-and-click adventure. Here's the issue. The programmers had 0 experience in 3D rendering and motion, and this game makes that very evident. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good. The next game would be Telltale Studios' first 360 and Wii game, CSI Hard Evidence. It was a major improvement on the 3D shortcomings that Ubisoft faced in the previous game. But by now, the idea had been so run into the ground that realistically, it was time to shape up or just stop making games. But this is Ubisoft. That doesn't happen. There would be 3 more titles, and none of them were remarkable. But if you like games that focus on the gore and the grossness of forensic investigations and murder pathology, then hey, you should check it out.
You'll find in a few different franchises that Ubisoft didn't play a major role in their development, or their cementing in the history of video game history. That is true for Driver. If you've never played Driver, it's an action driving game. That's the best way to describe it. GT Interactive, which is a fancy way of saying Infogrames, which is a French way of saying Atari is the overlord, started this series and pumped out 3 games before Ubisoft helped publish the PC and Wii versions of Driver Parallel Lines. So what we're saying is that in the acquisition of Reflections Interactive, which if you paid attention is now known as Ubisoft Reflections, Ubisoft was able to embed itself in this legacy franchise. Driver Parallel Lines was also a big departure for the game series. It's entirely open world and mini-games could be accessed from the in-game world versus a menu. It shares many elements with most GTA clones, and environmental destruction was a major point of the game. But it was originally meant to include online multiplayer for whatever reason, and that failed. You play as a getaway driver called the Kid, and you do tons of missions. it wasn't great. Then we hop to the platform where all franchises go to die, the PSP, with Driver 76. You play as Ray. No, not Ray Romano, and it is a revenge mission. The city is even smaller than before, and it wasn't popular at all. Ubisoft was quiet about the franchise after that.
But whispers of a reboot came through the grapevine and internet forums. There was an idea that Driver could make the jump to a contemporary setting while keeping the energy of the original Driver series. Hopefully this time, making it more fun. They did this by releasing Driver San Francisco. The game is awesome. It follows the plot of John Tanner after the events of Driver 3, where John Tanner wakes up from a comatose state to go after Charles Jericho. It's hard to explain just how fun this game is without actually playing it, but you can shift into other cars, like in Driver 2, almost teleporting across entire parts of the city without breaking up your mission. You can drive a real representation of San Francisco, complete with tons of unique vehicles to drive, and a pretty unique multiplayer option to boot. This game was awesome. There are 2 more entries, but they weren't developed by Ubisoft. These games are Driver Renegade 3D and Driver Speedboat Paradise, and yes, they're both shit. Oh well, at least they tried.
Oh boy, Far Cry, aka Sicjake's benchmark check for your computer in 2004. If you've ever played Far Cry, you know it's an insane, non-stop shoot fest of nonsense, with hit-scanning enemies and bugs that are abhorrent. But that being said, Ubisoft only published the first game. Their first Far Cry entry was a remake of the first title known as Far Cry Instincts. Far Cry Instincts was essentially a one-to-one remake of the original game, but limited heavily to the Xbox's abilities at the time. If you ever take the time to play Far Cry, you know one of its claims to fame is the ability to explore anywhere at any time. With Instincts, that was nixed for a far more linear approach. However, there are these feral abilities that change the gameplay for the better, as well as a modded storyline. You could also edit your maps and upload them to Xbox Live if you want to play against your friends. This game in many ways was superior to the original Far Cry. And if you want to start your Far Cry adventure, this is probably your best bet.
Instincts was a remake, but instead of focusing immediately on Far Cry 2, they decided to make a spin-off of the remake called Far Cry Instincts Evolution. It featured a new campaign, which was rather short compared to its predecessor. Then they released Far Cry Vengeance for the Wii, which was a remake of Evolution, and then they released Far Cry Instincts Predator, which was a combination of Instincts and Evolution combined. Jesus Christ! I don't think I've ever seen a franchise milk this hard since Street Fighter II had its 30 remakes. Oh, and this line also generated an arcade game called Paradise Lost. It's a rail shooter, a lot like Aliens Extermination, and if you enjoy money sinks that steal your quarters, feel free to check that out on your own time.
But it's time to return to what made Far Cry, well, Far Cry. In 2008, Ubisoft released Far Cry 2. Set in a fictional African city ravaged by civil war, you play as a mercenary who has a mission to kill a weapons dealer who's stoking the flames of a conflict. With an open world and with companions that assist you during your mission and a very competitive multiplayer, Far Cry 2 was an incredible game that for many of us set a solid baseline for the franchise. There are tons of ways to fast travel and tons of ways to interact with local wildlife, and by finding blood diamonds you could purchase new equipment and weapons. You could go guns blazing to accomplish your objectives, or you could find some stealthy way of accomplishing your goals. There are tons of weapons and tons of environments. It was even nominated for Action Game of the Year, Best Shooter, Best Game Design, Writing and Technical Engine. Just play it.
Far Cry 3 was released in 2012, and for many people it's considered one of the greatest games ever created. In the game, we play as Jason Brody, who's on vacation in Bangkok, Thailand, and while skydiving, he ends up on Rook Islands, which happens to be infested with pirates. Pirates who like to sell people into slavery. The leader of this pirate is Voss, or Vase, and he's a total douchebag, but goddamn, this game is good. Yet again, we have the usual weapons, and this time we have a skill tree that enables us to choose what kind of playstyle we want. You want to be stealthy and hunt? Use the spider tree. Want to be more aggressive and have better health? The shark tree. Want to be a distance killer? The heron tree. There's so much to do with this game, and unlike the previous two, it just felt more open world with endless possibilities of things to collect and challenges to undertake. It's a lot of action. Let's take it easy for a second. With a parody. That's what Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon was, and in many ways it was a parody of the things that made 1980s films hilariously bad. It references cartoons and other video games. Basically, you play as a military cyborg and you have laser weapons and seek to find the blood dragon that shoots laser beams from its eyes. It's hilarious, and it's a great time waster.
2 years later, we would receive Far Cry 4. This time we're in Kyrat, a Himalayan country, playing as AJ Gale. Again, stuck in the middle of a civil war between King Pagan Min and a revolutionary group known as the Golden Path. This time, we were exposed to more of an RPG-style progression system, at least in the way the story was presented. There were more side quests, branching storylines, and of course, all the things that make Far Cry wonderful remained loud and proud. Far Cry is one of the franchises that Ubisoft truly gave a damn about. And throughout its entire existence, it seems they cared more about making a true-to-form, solid game series. So thank you, Ubisoft Montreal. You've done good. Many of the aspects from here on out will be the same. In Far Cry 4, you collect random things that provide experience points, you still interact with fauna, and you still have a skill tree that is built upon by skill points earned from completing side quests. And it has multiple endings.
Then we had a spin-off with Far Cry Primal. It seems like we've hopped back to the earlier years of Instincts, but don't worry, it's badass. In this game, we play as Takar, who is a tribesman for the Wenja tribe. The time? 10,000 BC, meaning all of our epic weapons replaced by spears and other uniquely crafted weapons that make this game interesting. Ever wanted to hunt a woolly mammoth? What about a saber-toothed tiger? Well, you can in this game, and to many, it felt more like a survival game, but hey, it is what it is, and what it is fun. Next up would be Far Cry 5 in 2018. This time, we're not in any exotic location, we're not on some desolate island or high up in the Himalayan mountains. Nope, we're in Montana, where a doomsday cult has taken over Hope County and Joseph Seed is at the helm. You play as a junior sheriff without a name, and it's your job to make sure it doesn't become bigger than it is.
It's a fun game, but the problem is that it feels like it dumped everything that made Far Cry so good. It's a good game, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it isn't, but Ubisoft ensured that every version of this game had unique things that made their entries stand out. For example, Far Cry Instincts had feral abilities, 2 had mercenaries, 3 and 4 had skill trees, but here we are just doing chores. That's what it felt like. There was a spin-off called Far Cry New Dawn, and it takes place 17 years after the event of Far Cry 5, which if you've played Far Cry 5, the pretense of this game should annoy you because it shows that everything you did in Far Cry 5 doesn't make sense. It's like they wasted your time. Couple in the fact that you can tell that they kind of scrambled to make it feel more like the earlier games and add in just a dash of consumers knowing that this game wasn't going to make up for it. Well, you have New Dawn, and it was mediocre at best.
Finally, we have Far Cry 6. This is the most recent iteration of Far Cry, and it takes place on Yura, which is a fictional Caribbean island. Guess what happens? Civil War. Guess who's the bad guy? Giancarlo Esposito. You probably know him from Breaking Bad. He's a great actor. This time we're pretty much doing the same thing. And the only major difference is that there is a ranking-based system for your skills, and it's based on the specific region you're in, which there are a few. As you progress, the enemies get better weapons and gear, which means you'll get better weapons and gear. There are outposts and missions, and instead of the buddy system, you got the amigo system. It's a great game, and time will tell if Ubisoft will release another entry in this legacy franchise.
Ever wanted to tap in your imagination and be something different in life? Ever wanted to be a fashion designer? No, a babysitter. No, I got one! How about a baby? I know I can one-up this. How about a baby rock star figure skater? Well, you can! In the Imagine series. The whole idea of this franchise is that it is aimed at girls aged 6 to 14, and you play various roles. 46 to be exact. And all of those roles have their own game. They're total bullshit. All of them. No questions asked. This was Ubisoft making shovelware. So you remember how the Imagine series was just a shovelware of bullshit that Ubisoft popped out to make a quick buck? Just Dance is the AAA version of that. You dance to tons of music, and depending on your purpose for the game, it's either fun, or it's just a game you play to waste time. Some folks use it to lose weight, which is awesome and good for you. But if you're playing this to be a casual player trying to beat the library of Just Dance games, then look forward to 26 versions of this game. Have fun!
When you think of cinematic platformers, look no further than Prince of Persia. For many who entered this subgenre of platformers, this is where it all began. But the issue is, Ubisoft didn't have anything to do with it at first. The entire game was conjured up by Jordan Michener. For our older audience, this was the same guy who created Karateka, which was a landmark title for the Apple II computer. After the success of Karateka, he created Prince of Persia, and with that, 3 titles were generated. If you're curious about these titles, then feel free to check out our previous episode of the Radio Gaming Show, where we broke down the entire history of the platformer genre. Where Ubisoft comes into play was a reboot that happened in 2003, with Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. You play as a prince, you find a dagger. This dagger controls time because of some hourglass. You foil the vizier's plans, you fight people, rewind the time if you mess up, and even though you're Persian, Jake Gyllenhaal plays you in a 2010 film adaptation. Cheers! Sands of Time wasn't that bad. It was just different. Was it nice to breathe a fresh breath into a dying franchise? Yes. Was it the best game at the time? No. Did people eat it up? Absolutely. Tons of things are awesome about it, and tons of things aren't. So check it out if you want to. Also, curiously enough, there was a remake of the original Prince of Persia stylized with this character for the PS3. It was called Prince of Persia Classic. So if you want to deal with the nonsense that is the original Prince of Persia, but have better graphics, feel free to check it out. I'm personally not.
Sands of Time was followed up by Warrior Within. This time we're playing as the prince as he searches for a way to stop the Dahaka, an entity that fucking hates him for messing with the Sands of Time. This time we can not only use 2 weapons to attack, but we can also steal their weapons and stab them in the face with it. Fundamentally, this game is much darker than its predecessor, and while we can still slow down time and rewind the combat courtesy of the Sands of Time, the game does stand out for being slightly better than the first. The next title was Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones, also known as Prince of Persia: Rival Swords if you were playing the Wii version, and it's the final entry in the Sands of Time trilogy. You see, when we beat Dahaka and return home, we inexplicably reset all of the events during the Sands of Time. The bad guy we beat in the original game is back and kills the Princess Boo thing, and now she's an immortal monster. Oh no! So not only do we have to kill the Vizier again, but we have to contend with being emo because we have a dark prince persona that likes to slowly corrupt us. But worry not, these dark prince powers are pretty fucking cool, and they do make for an interesting addition to the overall combat experience of the game. Honestly, it isn't bad, but the strange retconning of the plot kind of threw a lot of folks off.
You want to know what threw people off even more? A Nintendo DS turn-based tactics game called Battles of Prince of Persia. Yeah, it's one of those card games. Think of Chain of Memories or Metal Gear Acid. Think of Mega Man Battle Network if it was unplayable. This game sucks. But if you like tactical games, this might be for you, and that's a very generous might. Critics of the game weren't very pleased.
It's 2010, and the last Prince of Persia game left a somewhat sour taste in the mouths of consumers. Ever wonder what it's like to try and please everyone in the world simultaneously? Then look no further than Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands. There are 7 different versions of this game, and they are all different. At the core, they are all action-adventure puzzle platformers. The PS3, 360, and PC versions are like the earlier games, with acrobatics, puzzles, moves, nonsense, you know, the works. The PSP version is a side-scroller hack-and-slash game like Assassin's Creed Chronicles. The Nintendo DS version is another side-scroller, but with lazy 3D graphics, and you have to use the touchscreen to control the prince. The phone version, 9 stages of nonsense. Internet version, yeah, we don't talk about it. If you want to check it out, play the main console releases. Trust me. You know what? This isn't working. Let's go back to 2008. Yeah, 2008 was a great year for gaming. GTA 4, Left 4 Dead, Far Cry 2, Devil May Cry 4, Metal Gear Solid 4, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, COD, World at War. All of the heavy-hitting franchises were dropping their bombs in the industry, and Ubisoft wouldn't be caught without a piece of the action, so they rebooted Prince of Persia. It's a very different game. This time it's rooted in the spiritualism of Zoroastrianism. You play as a guy trying to find his donkey, and then boom, you're trying to take down a bad guy. This time around, we aren't tied to just hallways and corridors. We're in an open world, which if you ask me is pretty progressive, considering how set in stone this franchise was for such a long time. You also have an AI-controlled companion named Alika, who helps out occasionally with some magic. acrobatics, and physical combat, so that's neat too. Also, for whatever reason, you don't die in this game. It's physically impossible to die. Every time you would come close to death, Alika will save you. And no, there isn't a limit. With 2.5 million units sold, this game did well, and honestly, it is worth checking out.
But hey, why even bother with enjoying a solid mainline reboot when you can play an animated nonsensical spin-off called Prince of Persia: The Fallen King? Why not play as Zal and walk around using the Nintendo DS stylus to break open boxes and do everything that the D-pad is supposed to do? Why not? The controls alone led to the downfall of this entry, and it didn't sell well. But good news, we have another reboot coming soon, and it's currently in development. It's known as Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. It was made by the same folks who did the Rayman series, so you already know it's going to be a side-scroller, and I'd even venture to say that they might stick their toes in Metroidvania-style gameplay.
Rayman is the bread and butter historically for Ubisoft. For many of us, it was our first encounter with a platformer that was more lighthearted and simply fun. But there are 45 games in the franchise, and we feel that the information could be better utilized in a franchise episode about Rayman himself. But don't worry, we won't stiff you.
The first Rayman was released in 1995, and boy howdy did it get some traction, with releases on the Jaguar, PS1, Saturn, DOS, Game Boy Color, and Advance, DSi, iOS, and Android. It was a very popular game. But what's so interesting is that the style of Rayman presented in the first entry is a very popular standard that Ubisoft consistently returns to. We did have some deviations with Rayman 2 and 3, and those games are awesome, but through and through, Rayman with this side-scrolling 2.5D style is heavily used. We say this because in many ways Rayman was one of the first franchises to use this style, and because of that, they helped pave the way for better platformers as time went on. There are spin-offs, one-offs, shit-offs, you name them, Ubisoft made them. In the main line, we have 5 games, and the spin-off series Raving Rabbids has 4 games. We also had some educational titles, golfing games, and silly games like Rayman Garden. As we said, we'll talk about Rayman at great length when the time comes. If you were like me, Red Steel was an amazing concept that got old pretty quickly. The whole idea is that the game utilized the Wii Nunchuck and the Wiimote to simulate guns as well as samurai swords. The AI was rather intuitive, and as a launch title, it was okay, but it could have been more. It did sell 200,000 copies alone in the United Kingdom and 1 million copies worldwide. Did you know that it had a sequel? It was a sleeper hit. Red Steel 2 was released in 2010 and features a dramatically different storyline than its predecessor. This time we play an unnamed hero from the Kusagari clan who is dragged across the desert and breaks free. It's a fundamentally different storyline than the previous game, which is refreshing, but I kind of enjoyed the original Red Steel, so I'm kind of biased. With a focus on Western and Eastern influences, it's a samurai Western, which is funny because there's 100% a game on the PS2 called Samurai Western. So if you played that game, it's the same principle. There's tons of side quests, safe houses, bullets to deflect with your swords, wanted posters to cash in on, and of course the Wii Motion Plus accessory to buy. It's worth checking out if you like this niche franchise.
This one is a legacy franchise from what would eventually be called Ubisoft Dusseldorf. So by technicality, this is a Ubisoft franchise. But I'm not going to go into depth, because there are about 8 games, and the only one that Ubisoft did themselves was the final entry. The first one was released by Blue Byte in 1993 for the Amiga and DOS. It's a city building game with real-time strategy elements. Think of Civilization, think of Anno, think of Caesar, think of Tropico. All of these games are simple copy and paste city builders with RTS elements as required. Without this franchise, Blue Byte likely wouldn't nearly be as epic as they are today. There are 8 games as we mentioned, and they are all the same game with very minor changes in either setting or campaign. The game Ubisoft had executive control over was The Settlers, New Allies, and it's the same game, but somehow managed to be worse than the others. Oh well, let's try to spin some positivity here. They tried. There are also a few handheld titles out there if you want to check them out as well.
There are tons of Tom Clancy games, so we'll just break them down by the theme that they represent. Way back when, there were tons of offshoot retro games. Red Storm Rising, which was a submarine sim, and then SSN, which was a submarine sim. And then The Hunt for Red October, which was a submarine sim. Yeah, that's what most of them were until 1998, when Rainbow Six was introduced to us. Rainbow Six is a tactical shooter. For most of the entries, you controlled a fire team and executed plans that you made to take an objective before the mission. That was the charm of the game for the most part. The first 4 titles were all presented in this style. But once Raven Shield was released, the franchise started to shift into this first-person shooter style of gameplay that would culminate in Rainbow Six Vegas, which had 2 entries. Contemporarily, everyone loves Rainbow Six Siege, and it has a massive competitive aspect that esports teams rock to this day. There have been 15 games total in this sub-franchise. Then we had Ghost Recon. Ghost Recon is much more of a squad-based first and third-person tactical shooter. Traditionally, these games feature much larger maps, rotating objectives that can shape the mission while you're executing it, and it's much more of a take your time and deal with your enemies kind of game. I didn't mind it, I find it somewhat fun. There have been 15 games in this sub-franchise as well, with Breakpoint being the most recent entry.
We've had a tactical shooter, and we've had a squad-based shooter. How about a stealth franchise? That's what Splinter Cell is. Ideally, it was meant to be the Metal Gear Solid killer. Newsflash, it didn't kill MGS. Konami did a fine job of doing that itself. Ha ha! Knee slapper! As a black operative, you play Samuel Fisher, and you're going around doing odd jobs to take out political opponents under the instruction of the CIA. There are 7 games in the franchise, and a remake is supposedly in the works. How about real-time tactics? Try End War. There's only 1 game in the franchise, and that's because it was a massive commercial failure.
Want to fly a plane? Play Hawks or don't, because it sucks. How about Division? Well, that's a franchise that's been kicking ass since its inception. The Division is a very different game from the others. It's an online-only action role-playing third-person shooter developed by Massive Entertainment. This is another game that has a very promising esports presence, and it has 4 titles under its belt. To me, it would be worth making a franchise episode about Tom Clancy, because his works and his contributions to the video game industry through his creativity, simply by attaching his name to a box, is unfathomable. Look out for it in the future. We'll go through every game and have a blast doing it. The Crew is exciting, but if you want a more streamlined arcade-style game like Excitebike, then check out the Trackmania series. You drive shitty cars over shitty tracks, and you get shitty currencies that can be used to buy more shit. There's 16 games, and none of them are groundbreaking to say the least. In my opinion, it's one of the more inflated, unsuccessful franchises to come from Ubisoft's library. The one that did see some success was the 3rd game, Trackmania Nations, and that's mostly because it was free. Yikes.
When you think of Ubisoft's open-world franchise of choice, you likely think of Assassin's Creed, solely because there are so many of them. But what would happen if we took the open-world aspects and sort of coupled them with hacking and GTA elements? You'd have Watch Dogs. In the game, we play Aiden Pierce, who is on a quest for revenge after a drive-by shooting killed his niece. Throughout the game, we learn about Aiden's past and some of the corrupt aspects of this fictional version of Chicago that has implemented a sort of computing network that keeps track of people. What makes Watch Dogs stand out when compared to its competitors is the ability to hack anything and everything. As Aiden walks through the street, he can steal information from people, siphon their funds, and if you're being chased by the cops, you can manipulate highway signs and turn on road barriers, and force the lights to change. There are tons of really cool things you can do. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it. But no matter how you feel about it, the game sold really well by Ubisoft standards, and did generate a DLC, Bad Blood. If we pit this series up against GTA and Saints Row, it kind of fits in the middle. But it is a slow and arduous game.
The sequel Watch Dogs 2 was released in 2016 and kept most, if not all, of the elements that made the first game awesome. However, for the first time in a long time, Ubisoft took into consideration many of the complaints that players had about the first entry. Because of this, they did a deep dive in how they could make their game more realistic. They hired real hackers to fine-tune the hacking mechanic. They took drives to California to scope out locations. Oh, and the music was composed by Hudson Mohawk. You know, the guy who did Seabat? While the game was rough around the edges when it was released, thanks to well-timed patches, Watch Dogs 2 was substantially better. With 10 million units sold, this game was incredible, and you should check it out if you get a chance. In 2020, Ubisoft released Watch Dogs Legion, which is a direct sequel to Watch Dogs 2. All of the elements that made Watch Dogs unique remained, and for the first time, permadeath was introduced. Don't worry though, this isn't Fire Emblem. You can elect to turn it off if you don't want to subject yourself to that bullshit. Plot-wise, it's 2029 in a fictional version of London. Dead Set continues to fight the powers that be, and yeah, it's the same game. But it's fun, if you're into Watch Dogs.
And that's it. That's all of the franchises that Ubisoft has given us throughout the years. From working with farmers to magically becoming one of the most popular game publishers in the world. Ubisoft held a significant presence in many of our childhoods, and we didn't even know it. Some played Assassin's Creed, and some played Splinter Cell, and some of us played Driver. While we don't know what Ubisoft will do in the future, we can rest easy knowing that they delivered tons of memories to us throughout the years, and those memories will never be replaced or taken away from us.
And that's it for today's episode. That was a good time. It feels good coming back and doing that. You know, these episodes take about 140 hours worth of editing. It is not something that you just sit down and you plug and play. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of making sure people's lines are right. It's a lot of getting video, getting footage. It's a labor-intensive thing. I don't want to say it's a pain in my ass, but it is a massive pain in my ass. But I love doing it, and I hope that you enjoyed watching this. If this is something that you can kind of put on in the back burner and do chores in your house, or if you're just doing a long drive, feel free to turn these on. There's a whole playlist dedicated to talking about franchises, genres, and companies, and that's what this project has always been. I do want to say massive shout out to Ubisoft for being the one company that doesn't matter after their logo shows up. I think it, like, throughout history, you'd hear, like, you see the swirl and you hear like bing 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 bing, and you'd be like, whatever, I don't give a shit, it's Assassin's Creed. True story. And I also want to give a shout out to Sicjake and TheDosNerd. Again, they have been there for me since the beginning of this YouTube and the mad ideas that I've had, and they did wait 2 to 3 years for this episode because of me. I procrastinated. It's my fault. And thank you guys for sticking around and being patient with me and not leaving the team and saying, hey, if you're not gonna do anything, we're adios, motherfucker. I appreciate that. And for anybody who loves this, please take the time to give me a thumbs up because it does help visibility for this. YouTube does not like long form content. It's just the way the algorithm works. So hopefully I can create something that y'all enjoy and continue working through this project. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre